and a huge warm welcome from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, to the third of our series on thriving after massive global disruption. And today we're looking forward to a presentation by Besma Momani, the professor from the University of Waterloo, on the topic of global economic and political challenges of COVID. But I just wanted to take a minute to talk to you a little bit about the rest of the series, because next week we have a break for a week, and we then follow that by presentations from the Middle East University on the 9th of June, Asian Institute of Technology on the 16th of June, and Chalmers from Sweden, University of Technology on the 23rd. University of Pavia will be presenting to us on the 30th of June, and on the 7th of July we have the City University of New York, finishing up on the 14th of July with Politecnico di Milano. So we've got a very full series, and we also have now got access to the previous two, the University of Strathclyde, where Professor Jeremy Lohr talked and gave us some really fascinating insight into what we've learned from previous pandemics. And then last week, where Hong Kong University of Science and Technology presented on a really wide and varied range of topics where the university themselves are making a significant impact into how COVID is being treated. So we've had a couple of excellent presentations, and we have several more to go. What we will be doing next week in the break that we have is we will be uploading onto the series website the previous presentations, including this one, and it will also allow us the time to deal with all of the questions that were asked, because what we're finding is that there are so many questions coming through, and so many really insightful questions that are coming through, that we don't always get time to answer them all. So we will be picking up on them on the website that we will send out to everybody the URL for it. And also for all of the students that are engaged with us, we are kind of making sure that we're monitoring attendance, so that those of you that do manage to get the 75% attendance will be receiving your certificates through from us, and they'll come through after the final session from Politecnico di Milano. So towards the end of July, you should get them through. They'll come via your own institutions. So a very full and exciting seminar series still to come, and as I say, some fascinating insights that we've had so far. This week's seminar is looking at the global economic and political challenges of COVID and the lockdown. And as I say, it's going to be delivered by Professor Besma Momani, and Besma has got a world-class track record. She is Assistant Vice President of International Relations at the University of Waterloo, and full Professor of Political Science. Besma is a Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. She was a non-resident senior fellow at both the Brookings Institution and Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., a consultant to the International Monetary Fund, and formerly a visiting scholar at Georgetown University's Mortara Center. So you can see from Besma's background that she has got a huge amount of experience and insight, and I can just see Besma appearing on the top left-hand corner of my screen. So having introduced Besma, I will now pass over and allow Besma to talk to us today about the global economic and political challenges of COVID and the lockdown. So Besma, without further ado, over to you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Good morning my time, and good afternoon for you. Sorry for the delay, but what would we be without some technical difficulty, because that is our new normal, right? So on that lovely front, I'm going to ask my colleagues at Strathclyde to please put up my slides, and we'll begin. Thank you so much. Okay. So we have about, let's say, 25 to 30 minutes to have a little bit of discussion after my presentation. And bear with me, I'm going to sadly depress you a little bit, because my argument is that we're going to face quite a bit of challenges before us because of this pandemic, both in terms of the global economic situation and the global political situation. And as the next slide will show, I'm calling this the perfect storm. And we have a visual there of what a storm kind of looks like. And if you don't know what a perfect storm is, it's this idea that, you know, it's one item is hard enough to manage as is, you know, currents that are going wild are bad enough. Add to that wind, add to that all the other factors that just unfortunately bring a system to a halt. So the metaphor here is we have a perfect storm. Unfortunately, I think there are a number of real big challenges before us. On the global political side, or on the global economic side, let's first talk about trade. Now, you have a little graph in front of you, and what you're seeing here is a real decline in global trade. It is something we have never seen before. And I want to caution people, because I think, as you'll see from some of the graphs I'm going to show you, we're so in the early phases of this being preliminary. I mean, you can imagine, as a corporate executive you know, said on a podcast I was hearing, we don't even know our own tally, because we're not there yet to provide people with an accurate picture of, frankly, the kind of damage this is doing to the corporate sector. So all of that data lag is becoming a real issue and getting a real feel for what's going on. That said, we do have some pretty good indication that some of the great you know, damage this is doing to the global economy is just the beginning of what I think is to come. So we have also what is called a decoupling of trade. And I'll show you a little slide coming up ahead that really kind of visualizes this. And this is this idea that, look at this lovely graph or image here of the production process of, let's say, a simple cotton t-shirt. And I think we all understand, you know, we're in an era of great globalization, where indeed, you know, every item that you're wearing, including our t-shirts, has probably been through a number of production processes, or what we call value added, in terms of, you know, it's not just the cotton. So the cotton may have come from China in this particular image here. These are also then sent to India, where the cotton is being perhaps refined and made into yarn and heat treated and washed and all that. It's not being produced in India into a t-shirt. It's actually being sent then to Bangladesh, where the fabric is cut and sewn into what you think of as the modern t-shirt. Then it might go to Sri Lanka to have a label put on it, your Nike swish or something else. And you add to that all of the layers, and we're not even talking about the marketing of that t-shirt. We're not talking about, you know, just the corporate branding that went into making of that t-shirt, the lawyers that negotiated that trade agreement. I mean, you can see just on the professional services side of things, you start to add even more aspects to the entire production process. So now we say, okay, that t-shirt is going to the UK to be sold in high street. So here's the challenge, of course, and I'm saying, now imagine, now all of these things are happening. You have the China-India border closed. You have a COVID outbreak in a Bangladesh factory, because of course it's close quarters. You have poor ventilation. You have the ripe conditions in the manufacturing sector increasingly, particularly when it comes to basic goods, enormous amount of potential for an outbreak. Add to that, Sri Lankan workers are in lockdown, as many countries are indeed telling all of their workers, you must stay home. Add to that, the ships are not allowed to dock in the UK. We have seen this happen in a number of places where indeed there is enormous pressure on much of the manufacturing process to not continue and to not deliver. Now you have, of course, your retail stores closed. That's something you're all very familiar with. You can't go shopping. So you have this enormous situation where consumption of goods and services is collapsing. It is basically that. Nothing is being made, nothing is being transported, nothing is being sold. And so this weak production, weak consumption, of course, means unemployment. As you can see, all of the people that are involved in that process, and this is just one simple t-shirt, and I, again, don't have the visual for all the professional services on the back end. We're talking about a lot of people who are unemployed. And as my next slide points out, that unemployment is very much something that we're all seeing very real in real time. Now, a couple of things. Where are we seeing this unemployment? It is, of course, everywhere, but there are countries that are more impacted than others. And I want you to understand that this is a real important part of, I think, COVID-19 needs to teach us something. And this is the beauty of being a political economist, is not just seeing this in terms of numbers, but also what is the dimensions of impact on societies, on institutions, and on people. And this is not a crisis that affects everybody equally. It's just not. And I think we have an enormous amount of data that is slowly trickling out, including the fact just recently, there was a very important study both in the United States and in the UK where this kind of data is being collected, that even those who are being hospitalized and dying from this virus are disproportionately people of color, disproportionately visible minorities, disproportionately immigrants. And that's important too, because they tend to be occupying the jobs that very much continue to have the potential for outbreaks. They are in the garment factories. They are more likely to be in our case in Canada, in long-term care centers where there's an enormous outbreak scenario. So that precariousness of their jobs also often means that they tend to be more likely the frontline workers, right? And so this is important. So as we think about all of this impact, please keep this in mind. We also know there's enormous gendered impact, right? Increasingly, we know that the fact that many of us are moving to, for example, working from home, that also means that women are disproportionately now not only home teachers, not only are they still in many cases carrying on a professional position, but also now they're expected to return to the sort of classical gendered positions or norms of the 1950s and 60s. And as a parent of 2 adult children, I can tell you that they still expect meals to be prepared. So that's a very problematic situation in my household. So clearly we're all facing very different types of dynamics, both being, again, gendered, those that are racialized, ethnic minorities, and those in positions that are, frankly, more vulnerable. Now, when we look at this on a global scale, right? So certainly in Asia Pacific, we see an enormous drop in employment, and that is unemployment basically. This idea that a lot of people will not be able to go to, in this case, enormous manufacturing jobs that are being now basically put on hold. That is a consequence, of course, of the reality that we know this virus, as I said, thrives in these situations of close quarters, thrives in places where there's already a poor baseline of health. So if you have comorbidities, you have diabetes, you have high blood pressure, you have all of these other factors, which increasingly we know is associated with being more likely to be poor. Add all that, and you can see why there is more risk, if you will, for many of those who are working in tight quarters in the manufacturing sector. Okay, so we're seeing here in Asia Pacific, a number of jobs are clearly going to be very much impacted by this. Certainly in all aspects of the world, we're seeing this kind of hit. Of course, it's not all equal, and that's a really important point. And in the next slide, I try to talk a little bit more about getting a sort of a sectoral breakdown of this, because this is important too. So, as you can see from the slides, and these are 2 different types of presentations. One is the United States, just because they have some good data and I wanted to show that, but also you can see what this means on the global. So on your right-hand side, you have a sense of where the workers are most at risk. And of course, manufacturing and retail are probably the most hit. And if you think about this, of course, that's what we see. All the clothes, all the shops around us, all of the retail outlets around us are very much closed for business. That, of course, has that kind of ripple effect that we talked about, which is the fact that we have manufacturers on the back end who of course can't produce or won't be producing because there's no retail. So the retail manufacturing sector is very much impacted. And that's why when you think of the previous slide, because Asia Pacific has become such a hub for enormous number of production of manufacturing, particularly of basic goods, but increasingly more sophisticated goods, let's call it, like electronics and the rest, that means they are going to experience a greater amount of unemployment. Other sectors, of course, that are being hit, anything to do with travel, right? I mean, nobody's getting on a plane. We are going to see hotels, resorts, airlines. Think about all of the industries that are impacted by the fact that we just don't have planes in the skies anymore, because I'm not willing to get on a plane for my own personal safety, but also the destination I want to go to is of course close to me. So all of that put together, we are going to see a number of, I think, I want to be very blunt, I think we're going to see a lot of mergers, a lot of bankruptcies in this sector. And some countries think about this as well. A lot of countries, we think about the Caribbean, we think about the destinations of hot, you know, the real kind of travel hotspots. They're going to be impacted, not just, of course, in terms of the airlines and the hotels, but all of the activities surrounding that. Think about all the craftspeople who, if you vacation, you know, they're very much dependent on having particularly Western tourists come to their islands and their countries, and they sell you their crafts. That is the kind of economic, trickle down that is going to be very negative. And I think we're all going to feel the pain very much because of that. Now, not all sectors are going to face the worst of it, but there is, of course, some that I think are feeling the pinch, certainly healthcare, education, but increasingly, of course, we are a little in the more privileged position to be able to, of course, sit behind a computer screen, have a Zoom call, and that really does mean that we're not nearly as impacted as others. Agriculture. Now, interesting, agriculture tend to be low risk because people do want to, of course, keep eating. But that is not all a panacea in the sense that it's not all going to be a rosy picture, because people can't get to their agricultural jobs. And we are very dependent, particularly in Western countries, to the fact that we have a lot of foreign workers who come to the fields, and this is often a hidden element of our food supply chains that we don't think about, but often we have seasonal migrants who come to do all of the agricultural jobs that many Westerners don't want to do. And so that is very interesting, and there's been a lot of concern about what this is going to do to our food supply chain. As I often say, maybe this is a time for us to think about, maybe we don't really need to have an avocado in January. Being in Canada, we clearly don't grow avocados, and certainly not in January. And so this is requiring us to really rethink, and we'll talk about sort of one of the very last slides I'll talk about is really thinking about how we need to sort of maybe reorient and rethink our very day-to-day lives and expectations, if you will. Okay, so again, back to that chart, I just want to keep pointing out real estate as well. We've heard quite a bit on this. I think this is something that we're going to see continue to unravel. Just recently, you heard Twitter is going to allow all of its employees to work from home. Shopify, a company that takes on enormous amount of retail space in my little town, is now saying that they don't think they're going to be going back to the office. So even the thinking about this, the shift from working from home, if we have that corporate sector increasingly saying, hey, you know what, maybe I don't need to invest in these enormous high towers in London or in Toronto, that is going to mean that the real estate sector is going to suffer, both commercial and of course retail space. So that is really very, very interesting. How many of these companies are frankly going to be able to survive in the old way? And anyone who's following kind of the business literature, or even just listening to corporate executives, they're often saying, you know what, those who were smart and did their digital transformation before this crisis, they weathered the storm. But those of us who didn't, get on board are really feeling the pinch and the pain. Okay, So in our next slide, we're going to talk a little more about how can we get out of this and what are the potentials. So there's this interesting kind of debate going on among economists about different types of potential recovery. And now, there's nothing perfect, but they tend to be something along the lines of, are we going to face a V-shaped recovery? This is this idea, and I think, you know, frankly, when we closed down on March 11th, I remember the day very quickly, or very clearly, we all thought that, you know, it's going to be 2 weeks. I remember, you know, telling my colleagues in my office, just take enough books and ideas and items, I should say, to hold you over for a couple of weeks. And I think we all thought, oh, you know, 2-3 weeks, we'll be back in the office. That's what we all anticipated, this V-shaped recovery. You know, we're going to hit rock bottom, and then as soon as things open again, we're just going to go back into the malls, we're going to go back into the office, and things will resume as is. The U-shaped recovery is one that obviously is, well, it's going to take a little time. We're going to sit at the bottom of this U-shape for quite a bit. It's going to be painful, but, you know, eventually we're going to come back up again. That is, of course, a slow recovery. And some, you know, thought, okay, we're going to find, you know, some pharmacological ways of being able to manage this disease. Maybe we'll get herd immunity. I mean, all of the very quasi-optimistic takes that we heard that thought, okay, you know, it's not going to be in a couple of weeks, but maybe by the end of the summer, we're going to be back to normal. I think we're all thinking that it's going to be what people are calling the Nike swoosh, which is this idea that, nope, it's not going to be back like this. It's going to be slow, protracted, maybe 2 to 5 years recovery. That's become the more optimistic one. And that really is about the feeling that, okay, we'll probably have a vaccine, being optimistic here. And even if you rush all of the trials and all of the production involved in making a vaccine, which is not easy, of course, maybe we'll be back to work in, let's say, January or February next year, maybe a bit longer. Now there's others who think, well, maybe it's a W-shaped one. And that is this is something that I think people need to prepare for, which is the idea that, okay, we're seeing retail stores kind of opening up, at least here in Ontario where I am. We see a little bit of the retail stores open, but there's this feeling that the second wave might come. Certainly for those of us who live in colder climates and returning to sort of being inside, ventilation systems may be impacted. With flu season, we know that there's a seasonal aspect to this. So there may be sort of ups and downs. You know, we may see a lull, then we see another outbreak, close again, open again, close again, open again. All of that is leading to this feeling that, maybe it's going to be more of a W. Last but not least, L-shaped. Are we looking at something that frankly never recovers? Are we looking at a situation where you're never going to have the retail experience of the past? We're going to see mergers and bankruptcies. Are we going to never be 100% return to the office, but maybe 20% return to the office? That's a very obviously pessimistic interpretation, but it's one that's out there. I think the thing that we need to think about is economic scarring. In other words, what's the damage that's never going to go back? The Shopifys that are never going to go back to the office, the Twitters that are never going to go back to the office. That's a scar. That means that'll never return. And so thinking about economic scarring, a lot of people are suggesting, well, and we've seen this, maybe it's time to think about automation. Maybe it's time to think about how can we use artificial intelligence to do things better. Maybe it's a time to adopt 5G technology, which allows us to have a better virtual reality experience, a better video conferencing experience, because 5G is very good when it comes to upload speed in terms of the VR and the augmented reality situation. So are we going to have a new office environment where we all wear our headsets and we basically become, you know, our personal spaces become our virtual office? Now, of course, that's all very speculative, but it is part of the rethinking and questioning about whether or not we're going to face economic scarring. Now, my next slide, I'm going to move to the global political dimension, because this is where I think we get the perfect storm. The perfect storm, unfortunately, in my opinion, is that as the world is closed, and we know this is closed, we know that we're not, you know, going back to normal, you know, immediately, but certainly today it is closed. We're going to see, I think, unfortunately, all of the as the perfect storm describes, all of these other things that have been going on the politics side, frankly, aggravate the economic and vice versa. So what are they? Well, they're populist nationalists, introverted politics, which I'll explain, and then lastly, deglobalization. And in the next slides, I'll start talking about each one of them independently. Okay, so what is populism? Now, if you haven't been paying attention to global politics, you may have noticed, you may not have noticed, but for those of us who are dissecting all of the leader statements and all of the activities that are going on, particularly those of us who are interested in democratic rights, it's been troubling, to say the least. You have a visual there of some of the populist leaders out there. Some you may know, obviously Donald Trump is the quintessential populist leader. But there are others throughout the country, and you may notice one of your own there. And really the message of the populist is one that is not new, but is very much aggravated by social media today. And I think it has a bit of resonance now, particularly in this COVID environment, that we need to be cautious of. So what is populism? It's basically this idea, and Casmude is really, I think, one of my favorite scholars who talks about this idea that it is the people versus the elite. You know, you hear this in Donald Trump, who always talks about, you know, the corrupt elite, the corrupt Washington swamp, people in the center of government, the deep state. They're all after trying to undermine the hardworking people. Now, in some cases, particularly in the European dimension, that often takes not the capital, sometimes it takes resonance in terms of talking about Brussels. So the European Union, right, is the corrupt elite. They're the ones that are out of touch with hardworking people. We see, for example, in some of the countries like in India's Modi or Erdogan's Turkey, we see a similar kind of dynamic, but now referring to the Western world. And they're all very similar messaging, which is, you know, these leaders are going to protect the hardworking people. They don't, they're not going to bow down to pressure from X, Y, Z. And again, fill in the blank where X, Y, Z is. They tend to be either Washington, DC, Brussels, or even back to Washington again. So this is really important because I think we are seeing already the populists take hold in many countries throughout the world. And that messaging has become strong. And the next slide, you'll see, I think, this wonderful image that I think encapsulates what happens with populist nationalists in the COVID era. And you have this image here of, this is a rally in, I believe it's in Michigan, where people are out saying, end the lockdown. You can see a couple of things in the background that talk about, and this is very particular to the American political culture, of course, but this idea of it's my freedom, right? It's my right. And you hear a lot of slogans of, you know, all work is essential, right? Picking up on this idea of essential workers. You know, my livelihood is essential to me, right? That very individualistic notion. And remember here, every place that has a populist nationalist sort of revival takes it differently, right? And some of it might be, in the case of the European Union context, it might be that our culture is under attack by Brussels. It might be our language is under attack by Brussels. All of that is very important to understanding that it doesn't necessarily have the same script everywhere, but nevertheless, it's quite important to see that there is this underlying sentiment that the people feel that they are being denied by what they think are elites, and increasingly some of those elites include public health professionals, right? You know, there's an enormous hatred, unfortunately, in particularly the right-wing populist sentiments in the United States against Anthony Fauci, which is the head of the Center of Disease Control. So even looking at the WHO, the World Health Organization, as somehow this is the corrupt elite who don't want hardworking people to work. For those of you who unfortunately find the kind of, let's say, conspiracy theories entertaining, there's an enormous number of this kind of, frankly, distasteful views that are online. But now you get to see the kind of thinking of their logic. And you have Donald Trump here, who really picks up on it and quite literally says, liberate Minnesota. Very important wordings, right? liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, save your Second Amendment, to have guns, to go out and work as you please, and not have public health officials, the corrupt elite of Washington, tell you what to do. And again, there's a lot of ironies there because Trump is a part of Washington, but we'll leave that aside. So in the next slide, we're going to talk a little more about, you know, what does this mean for our everyday politics? And our everyday politics is becoming increasingly introverted. I love this image of Donald Trump being surrounded by world leaders. This was here in Canada, and a couple of my colleagues, and I have a couple of friends that are actually in the background. I won't name their names, but you know, they, when I asked them, you know, what was exactly at that moment being described? And it was about, and again, this was almost a year ago, so this is not new, but it was about this idea that Donald Trump did not want to sign on to the terms or the idea that free trade benefits all. I mean, one of the corner or the key principles, frankly, of the G7 that have really held them together for a very long time. And this is part of that populist nationalist sentiment, right? Which is this idea that not only, you know, is this this globalization hurting us in terms of the hardworking people, but we need to stop this kind of interdependency that existed. So why is this problematic, particularly in the COVID era? Because the slogans now resonate more than ever. Think about this. This is the introverted politics that come with the populist nationalist rise. This idea, and these are slogans that I think we're starting to hear. We can't depend on X country for our goods. The whole struggle for PPE, personal protective equipment, the struggle for ventilators has become very much a nationalistic one, right? And this sentiment, often China pays the brunt of this, that China, frankly, is not to be trusted to share, you know, the manufacturing of important vital goods. That we can't have the kind of supply chains that we depended on for so long in our era of globalization. Keep the virus and people out. I mean, there's enormous xenophobia rising today with this idea that the virus comes from out there. And we saw this enormously evident in the discussion in the United States, particularly prompted by, of course, Donald Trump, who talks about the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, who he continues to try to slip that in there. And many of the right-wing Republicans want to similarly use that kind of language because it has to be a foreign element. It can't be discussed as somehow a domestic or community spread. The idea of it being a foreign a virus is really part of the attractiveness of it being us versus them. And the key thing here is that real leaders are ones that protect the people from the corruption of everything from free trade to health officials that tell us, you know, to stay home. This is part of the logic of much of the populist nationalists. Here's another element: don't spend money on other countries. We're going to see an enormous decline of foreign aid. This is a reality that is going to, I think, accelerate part of our introverted politics. As the populist nationalists continue to gain steam, we're going to see increasingly the sentiment that why are we spending money on everything from the WHO to sending money to foreign aid? That is really quite problematic, and I'll talk about that in a second. Lastly, invest at home, create jobs here. That is really the essence of what we see today happening, this idea that let's not have that global supply chain that you saw in the first instance in our second chart or slide, this idea that now let's have jobs here, let's produce goods here, let's not depend on outsiders. That is going to gain steam, and that's part of the introverted politics that I think we are going to continue to see. And in the last slide, I want you to think about this. What does this mean to everything that we've come accustomed to? Are we talking about deglobalization? This is a very popular sentiment today. I don't think all of us have the crystal ball. We're very unclear on where this is going to go. Certainly, if we get that U-shape, right? If we get the U-shape, maybe we'll go back to old patterns and there's no deglobalization. If it's a 2 to 3 year, if it's the swoosh, maybe it's going to be deglobalization because we're not going to rely on foreign suppliers or international supply chains to get our goods and services. We're going to want things now. are we going to have to change our economic thinking? This is something that I hope you guys will think about in your discussions. But there's a lot of environmentalists, a lot of people who talk about economic degrowth. The very idea that this is a time for us to maybe rethink the way we structure our societies. And last but not least, is this the end of multilateralism? Increasingly, we saw the kinds of breaking of those chains very much in the past few years. But is this really the nail in the coffin of multilateralism, this idea of international cooperation? Lots of questions to be asked, and I'm looking forward to yours. Thank you.
Excellent, brilliant. Thanks very much, Besma. That was a fascinating insight, and also some massive questions being raised around what the future of the global economy is, but also what the future of our own country's economies are. I've got a whole load of questions here for you. What can I start off with one though? That's one of the ones that came in kind of towards the end there. That's a fascinating question, which says, so which countries do you think will be able to overcome the economic impact first? And I think I'm kind of hoping that the answer is the one that I would like it to be, but who knows? So will it be democratic or autocratic countries that you think will be the first to overcome the economic impact?
That's a great question. There's been, and I'll even flip that a little bit, because the same question has been said about managing the very crisis, right? Look, there is attractive appeal to autocratic centralized control at the moment, in the sense that, yes, you can issue a lockdown, you can force people to take on public health advisories, in a sense, probably more seriously than you would in a democracy, because as we see, particularly in very individualized countries like the United States, there's a lot of pressure to protect the individual rights. And so in autocratic systems, that collective right, this idea that the public good, or this idea that frankly, the government has a diktat that says, close down, don't do X, Y, Z, is listened to because they very much control the streets, is a lot easier. And if it's about managing this crisis, many people have argued that, autocracies like China are able to do a better job because they can just literally call everybody to shut down and everybody, complies. I don't believe that. And we don't know until, frankly, the data comes in, and that may take some time. And as the academic here, I have to be a little cautious to say that I need to see the data first. And I don't trust the data coming out of autocracies. That is just the reality. And we look at some of the countries that have been most impacted. Think about Iran, think about China. The numbers that they are suggesting for their death rate just frankly don't seem plausible. They're absolutely impossible, in my humble opinion, to be true. So we can't take their word for it. And similarly, we see, for example, in China today, for the first time ever, very fascinating, I think, economic, let's say, news, is that they have basically for the first time not put out a goal or a target number for their economic growth strategy. China was at one point obsessed with making it 7% GDP growth per year. And then they did something very interesting a few years ago by saying it'll be a range between 6.4 to 6.9. And everybody, including myself, were like, oh my gosh, the Chinese have given us a range. That's incredible. Well, the last Communist Chinese Party meeting, which just happened about a week ago, they decided not to even have a target. That's unbelievable. So that means that their economy is probably you have to read between the lines when it comes to China, they're probably not even close to seeing that kind of GDP growth rate. So this is all to say we need some time for retrospective. We don't know who or what type of system is going to survive this. I think that there are merits certainly to some autocratic ways that frankly are able to get people to comply with lockdown that you can't get in a liberal democracy, despite, for example, here in Canada, and similarly you have the same, I think, in most parts of the UK. They are saying that, yes, we expect you to stay home, but no one's preventing me from getting in my car. No one's telling me I can't go down the street. And so, of course, that means compliance will be, in theory, not nearly as tough as some countries that have said, the military will stop you and will arrest you and put you in prison, as we find in many autocracies. That just doesn't happen in a liberal democracy. So we have to wait and see. That's not an answer to the question, but it's a great question. And I'm still very hopeful that I think many liberal democracies will be very much resilient in the long run.
Great, thanks very much. It was a great first question. I kind of, just following on from that on a fairly similar theme, I guess we'll try and kind of theme the questions as much as we can. But there's been an awful lot of discussion of political leadership, and some countries, for example, New Zealand, I think Germany in Europe, South Korea, are being held up as having done particularly well, whereas others, the UK, USA, the kind of obvious ones, haven't done so well. How much does leadership, do you think, play into the type of recovery that these different countries will have? And I think particularly when we're talking about V-shape, U-shape, W-shape, what do you think the role of leadership is in that?
I think it's immensely important. This is where, frankly, liberal democracies do thrive. And it's about not just, so communication is also about building trust, and they go hand in hand. And we've seen a number of leaders, and New Zealand's a great one. Certainly, I think in Canada, you know, our leader has done a very good job, but you can even point out in the United States, for example, Governor Cuomo of New York is sort of, you know, often put out for being very clear in his messaging. Merkel has done a fantastic job. And what we see in terms of the elements that make good leadership is, of course, knowledge, compared to those, I think this is not controversial to say, compared to Donald Trump's public speeches and daily briefings, they're like night and day. You know, the comedians have a very good time with Donald Trump because some of the advice that he's given and some of the ideas he's shared are just beyond nonsensical. So what you see here is it's that idea of you know, explaining to the public why you're doing certain restrictions, your hopes, your fears. That being a public communicator and building trust is really a real sign, I think, of leadership. And a number of liberal democracies have created those types of leaders that really comfort a lot of people, but then also allow there to be compliance. And that's what we see in some of these countries, that when you have a leader who can explain this crisis very effectively, that can also be quite honest and sincere about saying, we just don't know how this virus is reacting. We don't know the long-term damage to the health system. Let's take that ounce of precaution and not have you go out there. Increasingly, the messaging we're seeing today, for example, is wear a mask. You know, that mask is not because you're sick, but because, or I should say, to protect, necessarily to protect you, but to protect others, because there's a very high rate of asymptomatic people out there who may be carriers of the virus and not know it. So that public duty, that sense of put your mask on because you may not be sick, and not know it, but you may actually have, you know, the viral droplets that will infect others who don't have a strong immune system. That kind of building trust and effective communication has really allowed many leaders to shine. And I think there are a number of liberal democracies where you have leaders that have done a fantastic job. I think Merkel, with her scientific background, you know, it's been very interesting because she's very well, obviously, informed and is able to communicate that in a way that people understand, but more importantly, feel that they're confident that she has the requisite knowledge. And again, I can't help but pick on Donald Trump because frankly, it's easy. You know, if you've seen the clips of him suggesting that maybe people should drink a little bit of disinfectant, it's just absolutely absurd what's happening in Washington, D.C. That doesn't build confidence. And in fact, we saw people who did drink disinfectant and were very much rushed to the emergency room. So that's the kind of value of good leadership, absolutely.
Thanks, Ms. Mill. We'll get time for another couple of questions here. There's one or two that are kind of focusing on specific areas of economics and politics. One question here that's an interesting one, because I know that it's getting a bit of coverage certainly in Scotland and in the UK. And it's about the your thoughts on mass unemployment, and do you think that if we are kind of going to be looking at significant unemployment, that this would be the right time for governments to introduce or consider introducing universal basic income?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about that, even in North America here. Certainly, I think we kind of have something equivalent to that right now in Canada. For example, we have a program that essentially, and it's quite novel, of course, and the requirements for reporting are, in relative terms, quite weak, in the sense that you don't have to do a lot to report, a lot of information. It's a very simple form online, and eventually the government will give you about $2,000 a month. And the idea is that should sustain you to take care of basic necessities and so forth. Similarly, in the United States, there's a similar program, and I believe it's either $1,200 or $1,700 US a month. I'm sorry, I can't recall. So there's something to that effect right now. And there's a lot of debate even in international economic organizations like the IMF, which has, historically been very much on the fiscal prudence side of things, now saying to governments, spend. It's okay. This is not a time to think about your fiscal spending in that, austerity mindset. Spend as you need to, because this is something that we have never seen before. It's really unprecedented. And I think it's fair to say, and I'm one of the skeptics who believes that I think we are going to face a depression that is far more severe than an economic recession. And the characterization difference between a recession and a depression often is one of mass unemployment and mass structural damage. And I think you've seen from my commentary that obviously on the pessimistic side, unfortunately. So what I think in terms of basic universal income is that we do need something. I don't know if I'm a fan of the forever give everybody $2,000 in Canada, but I think for the short term, this idea of helping people to overcome this until we get to that swoosh scenario where we're back to some sort of normalcy, then yes, I would argue this is something that needs to be done. I don't think it needs to be a permanent feature of our economic policy making, but it will have to happen that way. And I just want to point one last thing here. In terms of how can governments get us out of this, in terms of the policy tools, remember here, we're at an era of the lowest interest rates ever. There's not much that governments can do in terms of monetary policy. It can't lower interest rates anymore. They're pretty much at rock bottom. In some places, they're in the negative. In other words, they're telling banks that if you don't lend, we're going to punish you. So we really only have fiscal measures. We only have the opportunity to basically support people by spending money on people. And that really is just the reality of the times. Unlike the 1930s and the Great Depression, when we had high interest rates, this is the only measure we have before us, is to spend. So fiscal stimulus is the way to go. But I do want to be careful here, because we can't have all fiscal measures we call this, for example, shovel-ready programming, this idea of just build it into construction, which is sort of the way that many governments have done in the past, is just spend money by putting these massive back-to-work projects in place. Maybe that's not the way to go. And I think the environmental aspect is really important here. Going back full circle here, we spent too much time on that. Maybe we need to think about different ways of doing things. Maybe we don't want to invest in more of the built environment, but invest in everything from clean technology into green technology that allows us to, I think, come out of this in a better sense. So I think there's a lot of reckoning going on in government policy making, and it's going to require good liberal democratic debate about where do we want to be when we come out of this crisis.
Great, thanks. We've got a couple more questions, then I think we'll let you stop talking, because that's after an hour, without so much as a glass of water. One of them is that I've always got an interest in is around the Sustainable Development Goals and the SDGs. So if we are entering an era of slowdown whether it's a V-shaped depression, if it's a U-shaped slowdown. But if we are entering a period of slowdown, which I guess most of us would think inevitably we will after this, do you think that this could have a positive impact on the SDGs? And how do you see it playing out through SDGs?
Yeah. So the SDG goals and the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN put out are 17 goals really to lift the poorest countries. And I'm on the pessimistic side, and there's a couple of things here that make me very pessimistic. One, obviously, as you saw from some of the slides that I had, you know, this is really hurting developing countries' jobs. Many people are going to be out of work. Globalization, like it or not, has lifted many people out of poverty. Everything from obviously workers in manufacturing who feed into you know, supply chains, to travel and tourism. All of that is coming to a halt, and so that's not healthy. The other aspect is workers' remittances. You know, one thing we keep forgetting, and we must keep our minds on, is the fact that a lot of people do send money home to their countries of origin. And workers' remittances are going to be at the lowest level we've seen historically. And many countries, you think about the Philippines, many, you know, Southeast Asia, really depend on workers that they have sent to other countries who won't be able to send money home. Not only is the entire infrastructure in some cases, you know, blocked for them to send that money back home, but more importantly, they don't have jobs themselves. And so this is really devastating. Foreign aid is going to, I think, unfortunately also decline significantly, back to that both populist surge, but also remember here, our governments are spending a lot of money on us at home. And when it comes to sort of trying to balance the budget, and eventually in a year or two, there's going to be a reckoning or discussion about how do we balance the budget. Unfortunately, foreign aid tends to be the first place that we see that kind of decline of transfers. Same goes for money that goes to international institutions like the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the UN, that carry out so many important programs. Our donations are going to shrivel up. Think about it. If you are a person who is worried about your long-term financial health, even short-term, you're probably not writing a check to Oxfam. You're not writing a check to the Red Cross. And that is devastating for the developing world. So unfortunately, I would say when it comes to UN SDGs, we are farther away from meeting the 2030 goals that we had put in place several years ago. And I think we're going to be having to have a discussion about readjusting those goals as well.
Right. Okay, thanks. Okay, we'll get one more. I think we'll get time for one more question, and I think let's try and finish on a positive. Let's
try.
Exactly. So, if you were to think about the kind of organisations and sectors that you think will come out of this the strongest, what would they be?
Great question. Anything digital. Anything. This is, look, we're using Zoom technology, how many of us knew, I mean, I certainly did because we're all in the business, but think about how many people know the word Zoom, right? So, I mean, my grandmother knows what Zoom is now. And that is really the reality of the technological sector. They are booming. In fact, one of the things that we keep looking at, particularly in the United States, is the fact that you have the stock market surging, right? It defies all logic. Why is Wall Street doing so well at a time when everybody's suffering? And that's partly because people are pouring money into tech stocks. And so anything technological is going to do well. I think automation, the fact is manufacturing, this has been a time for them to think about how can they automate. And so if you're in the robotics industry, and some of my university is very strong in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and all things STEM are being very much supported right now. And the demand for automation, the demand for new ways of doing things that take advantage of technology is certainly on the rise. And so that is a sector that is going to do very well. I think we're going to see an opportunity with all the data eventually pouring in for really interesting machine learning, interesting artificial intelligence being applied to everything from logistics, which already had been, frankly, picking up on many of these aspects already. But I think we're going to see that revolution in emerging technologies that is going to really make this a lot easier. And that's why there are people who are hopeful about everything from quantum computing to 5G technology, all of the emerging technologies that are going to help us because it gives us more processing speed, more ability to apply all of these great technological revolutions to many aspects of our lives. So there is hope in those sectors, but I think this is the one thing that I want to caution us all. Those are not labor intensive. This is really the thing that we have to think about, right? And we know this, when you go digital, when you go technologically dependent, it means less labor. And so the unemployment factor is huge. You simply cannot employ the same amount of people when you go automated. When we start to buy things online, as we've seen, we just got accustomed to buying things on Amazon. That means the retail storefront is going to be not nearly as busy. Well, at the end of the day, Amazon will never employ as many people to service that retail sector as it would if we were shopping in our malls. And that is a reality. So automation is great, technology, digital, but it comes at the cost of labor.
And I suppose when we are talking about that there are massive knock-on effects. So as we move much more online in areas like retail, so the retailers that have a very strong digital and e-commerce strategy will probably be okay. But actually, you then have that kind of impact on real estate. You have the impact on all the ancillary services, the facilities management, etc., that sit behind it. So that it has got quite a significant impact in reshaping our economy and the kind of culture that we have.
And let me just add here too, is connectivity is now more vital than ever. I mean, if we've learned anything from this is, connectivity, being online has become a basic good. And yes, the world is more and more online, but there are many, many places, including many rural areas in my country, indigenous communities that are still not online. And so the rush to ensure that everybody is able to participate in the next generation of economic growth is still something to be done. And we think about all the developing countries that have yet to even get 3G, let alone 5G, means that there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, brilliant. Besma, can I say a massive thank you from myself, Phil Considine, from Policy at Strathclyde, and from everybody at the University of Strathclyde for what was a fascinating insight and to get the benefit of your thought leadership, your knowledge and your experience. This webinar will be available probably tomorrow, the day after. We will put it online and we will send to everybody the link. And what I will perhaps ask, Besma, if you don't mind, is that in the next couple of days, if we gather up all the questions that we just didn't have time to ask, and then we can maybe either email you or we'll give you a phone or do a quick Zoom and we can kind of go through them. So that what we can do is we can post onto the website the answers to the questions that we just didn't have time to get to. Thank you to everybody for joining in today, and we've had probably as broad a global participation for today's session than for the last few that we've had. We've had North America, we've got Far East, Middle East, Europe, North Africa. So we've had a huge range of different peoples and different perspectives. And I'm looking here as the feedback's coming through already, saying thank you from pretty much everybody for a fascinating insight. I look forward to seeing everybody 2 weeks today when we will have our presentation coming from Jordan, from the Middle East University, and we will send through a link and an invite to that. That one will be run at 1 p.m. UK time, so an hour earlier. So for those of you from Waterloo and from City University of New York, you've got a very early start in a fortnight's time if you want to join us live. Equally, you'll be able to pick up on that one as well on the website a day or so later. So thank you very much for all of your contributions. Thank you massively to Besma and to everybody at Waterloo and Strathclyde for making today possible. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye.